talk about the costs of our energy in the United States. And so we'll talk about energy costs in perspective. We're actually going to talk about the cost of electricity from various forms. And so this little model engine is demonstrating how we can convert kind of a fossil fuel hydrocarbon into steam to produce electricity to power this light, for instance. We will also talk in the module about the cost of owning and operating vehicles. And of course we know that different kinds of energy now are entering new vehicles. So we'll look at the comparison between gas engines and electric engines. My little engine really wants to run. We're also going to talk about the cost of energy efficiency in the module and how an investment in a more modern, efficient appliance can really pay itself back over time. All households need energy, and it comes in various forms. The most common ones are electricity, and I have my electric bill right here. Natural gas is the next one, and then of course fuel for our cars and small engines. Most Americans today spend between $3,000 and $10,000 in energy expenses annually, and that's normally about 9% of their income. Combined, it's in the top 5 of all household expenses. And here in this pie chart, you can see how the other categories, how households spend money on various expenses. Another important point is certain low-income households have challenges with the affordability of energy. And this is because obviously their energy needs are very, very constant, kind of uncorrelated to their income level, whereas the cost of energy may be a higher proportion of their income because they're earning less. And so when we look at some of these graphics, we see that for certain sectors, that energy allocation may be upwards of 20%. And energy is what we would call an inelastic commodity, meaning that our demand does not really vary much with prices. In fact, one of these graphics will show you that electricity is one of the most inelastic of all commodities we buy, even behind things like food and healthcare. Now let's talk about the breakdown of some of our energy costs. Of course, here's an example, I guess as I mentioned, of the natural gas bill. And there are always sort of 2 major components of our expenses when we purchase energy services. The first is kind of a fixed charge, and the second is a variable charge. The fixed charge really is sort of the initial cost to obtain that service. That might be deemed as a customer service charge, kind of an annual or a monthly recurring fee. And then the second, of course, is related to the amount of that service that we're using. It's really connected to the amount consumed at the meter, that is, for example, a natural gas meter or the electric power meter. We talked a little bit about the infrastructure upstream of our meter in a prior unit, and so that would sort of explain why there's a fixed portion. And that is when we actually use 0 of the service on a variable basis, there is still some ongoing fee that's incurred. So that's why we think about these fixed and variable units. Now we can think about that as it relates to the generation itself. So here I have a couple of models of sort of a simulated electric power plant, if you will. And in this case, we're looking at a steam engine, which is, basically includes the asset of the facility itself. It includes the fuel supply that would go into, burn heat the water and make the unit function. And then, of course, there's ongoing labor and maintenance to ensure that the engine, operates and generates power. So these are sort of the 3 buckets that you could think about with electric power. For something like a solar array, there is still the fixed asset, and then obviously there's a little bit of labor, and then there's basically free energy. So the solar input would be kind of the fuel or energy cost, but it is basically unlimited from nature. Now let's think about a car. A car is another thing that we come in contact with frequently and have energy costs associated with. Again, you have the fixed asset that you would have to purchase. This might resonate a little more clearly with with people that actually own a car, because now you can understand there is an asset that you are responsible for. It's not the utility, as in the case of the generator. And then, of course, there is the labor and maintenance to operate and maintain the vehicle. And then, of course, this battery sort of simulates the energy needed by that car. So now we're going to talk about the economics of each of these three things and try to understand how we can relate to the cost that we pay for our energy services. A third sort of category would be buildings. And buildings like the one that we're in today that we would consider net zero energy and net zero water is another sort of way of associating with energy costs and use. So let's dig into this a little bit more deeply and go investigate the building a bit. Okay, now we're in the control room of the Candida living building. And we talked the fact that the building is net zero for energy. What that actually means is that the input, which is the PV load, which is the upper right monitor, is actually on average generating more energy than the left meter, which reflects the total building load, the devices and the heating and cooling systems and so forth, the lighting in the building on an annual basis. So now let's go upstairs and dig down more into the levelized cost and those various components of energy cost. Okay, now we're on the roof of the Candida living building at Georgia Tech, and we're going to break down for you what's behind the levelized cost of electricity. It's a very straightforward way to compare multiple technologies. We basically take the entire capital cost associated with the generation form. In this case, for example, the solar panel, we would buy the panel, and then we would allocate that over the lifetime of that panel into an individual kilowatt hour charge. So that's the first step, is to allocate the capital cost over the lifetime generation. Then, of course, there would be operating and maintenance costs. In this analogy, it would be the cleaning and the maintenance and the controls and programming for the inverters. And paid for that as a per kilowatt charge as well. And then the final piece in a levelized cost equation is the energy or fuel charge. And of course, in the case of renewables, we know that that's virtually zero. So then when we add all these three pieces up, we now have a composite price that gives you a full picture, and you can then compare things that are very dissimilar in terms of their energy resource. And here now we have a plot that compares that in modern economic terms for the primary resources that we have in the U.S. and that we've talked about in other modules, namely coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, and other forms of energy generation. And what you notice here is that for the renewables, obviously that energy piece is near zero, doesn't appear the yellow bar, but the capital cost can be somewhat more variable. In the case of this rooftop here, we're somewhere between residential and commercial scale. Whereas for something like coal and natural gas, you'd have, again, a common sort of baseline capital cost and then a relatively variable fuel charge based on the commodity cost of coal or natural gas. And therefore, you can see how these things stack up compared to each other. And recall that prices in America, in other words, to the end user, are somewhere between 10 and 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So you can see how much lower these costs are than that, and how utilities could kind of optimize the mix and still meet a viable market price. And now when we look more closely at solar in particular, scale matters. So the bottom line here is that a large farm with thousands of acres is obviously much cheaper overall than something like an individual residential unit. And so you see that sort of illustrated here in the sense that utility scale can be very, very affordable, on the order of 3 or 4 cents, very comparable to those fossil fuel resources right to today. Whereas as you decrease the scale of the solar array, obviously the cost to install goes up, and the cost to operate is still relatively low, but on a price comparison basis, it's more expensive to do a rooftop at home. And then the next plot we'd like to look at is the marginal costs. So now what we're doing is we're really looking at the effective real-time cost excluding the capital piece. So that is how sort of utilities make day-to-day decisions, since they already know they're going to have to pay for that asset anyway. Now they're making a real-time decision about which one costs the least to produce that additional kilowatt of electricity. And so you see, this is where renewables really shine, so to speak, in the sense that there is no ongoing energy input, and they're very cheap. Whereas something like a gas or a coal plant would have to incur the cost of the prime energy resource or the fuel. Okay, now let's talk briefly about other things that might affect the cost. Things like federal subsidies to support renewables, so-called investment tax credits, might reduce 10, 20, even more percent of the upfront cost on a new project. Another one might be a carbon tax, which would then be appropriated to generating resources that emit carbon proportional to that carbon emission amount. Something like $50 a ton per carbon would equate to something like 5 cents per kilowatt hour for coal generation. And it would then be added to that LCOE. Or that same $50 per ton might translate to a penny or two on natural gas. So you get the idea that we would try to correct for those emissions in the price that the market bears. And then a final one might be the time of use. So actually it turns out it doesn't cost the same to generate electricity at every hour, every minute of the day. In fact, right now, there's lots of abundant solar, and we can see a favorable price economic return on solar generation, whereas when we need that power after dark, it's not there, and we would have to pay something different because it's coming from one of those other resources. So there are different ways of playing with the time of use and what we call demand side management to make sure we allocate prices equally over the day. And then the final point here on LCOE is we're not talking about one deterministic value on any of these. There's always a range involved, right? And sometimes it's quite uncertain, quite broad. So this plot here done by a third party shows you really how wide and uncertain some of the price estimates can be, depending on lots of these system variables. For instance, things like nuclear can be all over the map, from very mature nuclear that's reaching the end of life at a 60 or 80 year life versus very new nuclear is becoming rather expensive in terms of safety and operation. And the same for every other sort of form of generation here shown on this plot. So now let's go down and talk a little bit about vehicles and how the total cost of ownership can relate to LCOE. Now let's talk about the cost of ownership and the energy going into vehicle operation. It's very similar to the way we computed the levelized cost of electricity. Probably a little easier for consumers to relate to because many of you actually own a car. So when you think about that, you have your purchase price, and often you even pay for it over time. So you might have a monthly payment. In fact, you would just extend that to a price per mile. So the number of miles per month, and you convert your asset payment into a per mile payment. And that's how you deal with the capital. And then you would add in average maintenance costs and so forth associated with that, oil changes or routine checkups to keep the car going. And then of course the third piece in the same way would be to add the variable expense, which is our energy cost. Normally fuel, in the case of an EV, electricity. Since a vehicle is a fairly long-lived asset, we might assume a 10-year life. Many cars live 16, 20 years today. We might assume 13,000 miles of driving per year, which is typical in the United States. And other assumptions related to the time value of money, average fuel costs, we would just sort of make generally accepted assumptions around that. And then what we could do is compare on this plot here, how the price would compare to own and operate a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle with, let's say, a diesel and then a hybrid and a plug-in hybrid and an EV, all on sort of one standard metric, and that is the total cost of ownership. And so very similar to what we saw with renewable energy, we also see that the upfront cost of the more advanced vehicles is naturally a little bit higher, that blue bar, and the ongoing electricity cost, which is that purple bar, is naturally a little bit lower because the price of electricity is much cheaper than the equivalent energy cost of gasoline. In this case, we've also added a bar to capture sort of insurance costs, and that's generally a function of the capital price. But anyway, what this shows you is a very simple metric for converting all-in costs, including the energy piece, to a levelized basis. And now let's look individually at the comparison of new technologies with conventional ones. So what we've done here is split up into sort of three categories. Often an automaker will have one chassis and they'll sell an internal combustion version versus some advanced version, and that's what we're depicting here. In the case of the Toyota RAV4, for example, we're adding a hybrid option. And the effect is obviously a little bit lower fuel costs, but more or less the same overall net impact on total cost. And then in the case of the Ford Fusion example, we're comparing a conventional Fusion with one that has a plug-in hybrid option. And obviously that's more expensive because there's sort of two power plants working together in hybridized fashion, but you get the advantage of reduced emissions and more functionality from the hybrid. And then in the last case, it's a conventional Kona with an electric Kona. And again, there's maybe about a dime difference in those two variants. And so this is very insightful, and what we note is that the PHEV has the highest premium cost overall, but the EV and the PHEV have the lowest energy cost because they're relying primarily on that electric powertrain. Other factors that could affect this, again, like the LCOE, there's a natural uncertainty in these bands. The price of gasoline is a big variable, one that very few people can predict with great accuracy, but that will impact the way that these analyses compare. Another one is EV tax credits. Right now in the United States, there are some programs to provide subsidies for EVs, and the potential for those to go away or to be reduced is there as well that will affect the cost. By the way, none of these illustrations include a tax credit, so that would obviously help reduce the overall cost of ownership. Miles of travel is also a big variable. The more you use a vehicle, the cheaper it becomes, per mile. So that's another variable that we would look at to change. And then some other features that might have non-cash benefits, like HOV lane access and other kind of fees and registration for recuperating gasoline taxes. And so then, as a segue, now we will go to the final segment about energy efficiency briefly and talk about how the cost of efficiency can be very favorable. We see that efficiency in transportation is the most significant opportunity, but there are other important ones as well. Obviously, this shows a little bit of a rank order of where there is a big potential return on investments in efficiency, largely transportation and buildings. But of course, when we think about an efficiency technology, it's a matter of how much benefit it returns for how much cost we have to invest. So good examples are things like building heating and cooling, like air conditioners and furnaces, where you might upgrade a 78% efficient furnace to a 95% efficient furnace. And you would go through there's a lot of good online calculators to say how much savings would I have per year and over what payback period could I recoup my upfront investment. And then a final example is the energy efficiency investment you might make in a car with lower energy costs, like a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid or an electric. In fact, it's notable that a lot of Lyft and Uber fleet ride-hailing services use these advanced vehicles with very low energy costs because they're doing a lot of miles traveled. And so we can think about how there's a huge payback on fuel efficiency in vehicles. I hope you learned a little bit about energy economics today, and make sure you check out all of our other videos. Now we're going to take this baby out for a little spin.